Jake Murphy had seen a lot of weird things in his 37 years floating around the galaxy, but watching a 6-foot purple mantis creature hyperventilate over a mouse-sized fuzzy thing really took the cake. "Please, Mr. Murphy," wheezed Ambassador Klaxon through his translator, his forearms gesticulating wildly. "The squirrel of infinite terror has breached containment in Section C. My people, we simply cannot handle such a monstrosity." Jake looked down at his coffee mug, which read, "Galaxy's Okayest Exterminator" in faded letters, and took a long sip. The so-called squirrel of infinite terror was basically a hamster that had evolved opposable thumbs. Terrifying to a species that considered crunchy leaves a delicacy, sure, but Jake had handled worse things before his morning coffee. "Right," Jake said, grabbing his toolkit. "Same rate as always. And I'm charging extra if it's built another one of those tiny furniture sets." The thing about working pest control on a multi-species space station was that one being's adorable pet was another being's apocalyptic nightmare. The Harmony 7 station housed over 200 different species, and Jake had learned that fear was relative. The crystalline hive mind from Sector 12 would flee screaming from butterflies, while the seemingly delicate flower people of Zenthari could bench press a small shuttle and considered acid-spitting deathworms a minor inconvenience. Jake had earned his reputation the hard way. 3 years ago, when a pack of Theta wolves had somehow gotten loose in the diplomatic quarter, station security had called in a military strike team. Jake had walked in with a spray bottle filled with lemon water and a firm voice. 10 minutes later, the wolves were sitting like good dogs, and Jake was billing the station for advanced canine behavioral modification. "The stories they tell about you in the lower decks," Ambassador Klaxon chittered nervously as they walked toward Section C. "They say you once stared down a void leviathan until it apologized." "That's not entirely accurate," Jake replied, checking his equipment belt. "It didn't apologize. It just looked really embarrassed and slithered away." The truth was simpler than the legends. Jake had grown up on a farm in rural Texas where everything was either trying to kill you, eat your crops, or both. Moving to space hadn't changed the basic principle. Whether it was fire ants or plasma beetles, whether it was a raccoon in the garbage or a dimension-phasing scavenger in the food stores, pests were pests. "Here we are," Klaxon whispered, pointing a trembling claw at a ventilation grate. Tiny scratching sounds echoed from within. "It's been in there for 3 hours. My security team has cordoned off the entire section." Jake knelt down and peered into the grate. 2 bright little eyes stared back at him. The creature had indeed built a small chair out of wire scraps, and was sitting in it like a tiny king. "Hey there, buddy," Jake said conversationally. "Having fun redecorating?" The squirrel of infinite terror chittered what Jake had learned to recognize as the universal sound of "I'm not coming out and you can't make me." Jake pulled out a small bag of honey-coated seeds and shook it gently. The chittering stopped. "Look, I get it," Jake continued. "Artificial gravity, recycled air, processed food. It's not exactly paradise. But you're making the neighbors nervous, and my coffee's getting cold." 2 minutes later, Jake was walking back toward his office with the squirrel of infinite terror perched contentedly on his shoulder, munching seeds and occasionally making what sounded like approving comments about the station's architecture. Ambassador Klaxon stared after them in amazement. "How do you do it?" Jake shrugged. 23 years of marriage taught me that most problems just want to be heard and maybe offered a snack. As word spread through the station's gossip networks, Jake's legend grew a little larger. The human who talked to monsters. The one who treated apex predators like misbehaving pets. The man other species had started calling, in their various languages, Uncle Death. Though Jake preferred his business cards, which simply read, "Jake Murphy, he'll figure it out." The red alert sirens were still wailing when Jake finished his second cup of coffee and decided he should probably see what all the fuss was about. In his experience, the louder the alarm, the smaller the actual problem. The time the station had gone into full lockdown over what turned out to be a lost tourist from the Butterfly Nebula still ranked as his personal favorite overreaction. "All personnel to emergency stations," came the panicked voice of Station Commander Rodriguez over the intercom. "We have a Code Black situation in Docking Bay 7. I repeat, Code Black. This is not a drill." Jake raised an eyebrow. Code Black meant extinction-level predator on the loose. In 3 years working Harmony 7, he'd never seen a genuine Code Black, mostly because anything that qualified usually ate the station before anyone could sound the alarm. The corridors were chaos. Species that normally couldn't agree on the color of space were working together in perfect harmony to run away as fast as their various appendages could carry them. Jake had to dodge a stream of gelatin merchants who had literally liquefied themselves for maximum evacuation speed. Mr. Murphy! Ambassador Klaxon appeared from behind an overturned food cart, his purple carapace now a sickly green color. Thank the 7 moons you're here. We're all going to die horribly. What's the situation? Jake asked, though he was already walking toward the docking bay instead of away from it, which seemed to confuse several fleeing aliens. Vorthak. Klaxon whispered the word like it might summon demons. A full-grown Vorthak breached our hull and is currently, well, we're not entirely sure what it's doing, but it involves a lot of roaring and what sounds like furniture destruction. Jake had heard of Vorthak. Apex predators from the galactic core, standing roughly 10 feet tall with claws that could slice through starship hulls and a temperament that made hurricanes seem moody. The kind of creature that entire civilizations wrote strongly worded warnings about. Most species considered seeing one from a safe distance of several star systems to be good luck. So you want me to what, exactly? Jake asked as they approached the docking bay doors. We were hoping, Klaxon said hopefully, that you might talk to it, like you do with the other creatures. Jake paused at the sealed blast doors. Through the reinforced window, he could see something massive moving around inside. It did appear to be rearranging the furniture, though not in what most beings would consider an improvement. Let me get this straight, Jake said. You want me to have a conversation with a creature that's literally called the Death that hunts between stars. You talked the Void Leviathan into leaving. The Void Leviathan was lost and asking for directions. This is different. But Jake was already punching in his override code, because the thing about having a reputation was that eventually, people expected you to live up to it, and honestly, his afternoon was pretty clear anyway. The blast doors slid open with a hiss, and Jake stepped into the docking bay. The Vortak was indeed massive, covered in midnight black scales that seemed to absorb light, with 6 arms that ended in claws the size of Jake's forearm. It was currently using those claws to systematically shred a loading crane into decorative ribbons. The creature's head snapped toward Jake as he entered. 4 golden eyes locked onto him with the kind of focused attention that usually preceded someone becoming lunch. The Vorthak rose to its full height, which made Jake feel like a particularly brave mouse confronting a very large cat. Well, Jake said conversationally, this is awkward. I'm guessing you're not here about the welcome wagon. The Vorthak tilted its massive head, as if trying to figure out why this small creature wasn't running, screaming, or both. It made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a question. Yeah, I know, Jake replied, pulling out his toolkit. The accommodations aren't great, but it's what we've got. You hungry? Because if you're planning to eat anyone, I'd appreciate a heads up. Paperwork's a nightmare. Behind him, through the blast door window, Jake could see what looked like the entire station's population pressed against the glass, watching in horrified fascination as the human calmly unpacked his lunch in front of the galaxy's most feared predator. The Vorthak took a step closer, and Jake could feel the deck plates vibrate under its weight. This was it, he figured. This was how Jake Murphy, pest control specialist, became a cautionary tale told around alien campfires. Instead, the Vorthak sat down. Jake stared at the massive predator that had just arranged itself into what could generously be called a sitting position. It looked like a mountain had decided to take a break. Okay, Jake said slowly. That's new. The Vorthak made another sound, softer this time, and Jake realized with growing amazement that the creature was purring. Well, purring, if purring sounded like a small earthquake having a pleasant dream. You know what? Jake said, pulling out his sandwich. I'm going to call you Fluffy. Through the blast door window, Ambassador Klaxon fainted. Several other species began what appeared to be religious ceremonies, though whether they were praying for Jake's soul or trying to appease the monster was unclear. Jake took a bite of his turkey and Swiss, chewing thoughtfully while the galaxy's most feared predator watched him with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for prey animals. So, Fluffy, he continued, what brings you to our little corner of nowhere? Tourism? Business? Running from the law? Fluffy tilted her massive head and made a sound that Jake interpreted as interest. When he held out a piece of his sandwich, she delicately took it with claws that could have separated him into component atoms. She examined the offering carefully, sniffed it with nostrils the size of dinner plates, then ate it with surprising daintiness. Ha, Jake said. You like mustard, who would have thought? Over the following days, something unprecedented happened on Harmony 7. The Vorthak didn't leave. Instead, Fluffy began following Jake around the station like a 10-foot-tall, 6-armed shadow of death. She would wait patiently outside his quarters each morning, accompany him on his rounds, and seem genuinely interested in his pest control techniques. This is highly irregular, Commander Rodriguez told Jake during their third emergency meeting about the situation. "We have 17 different species threatening to leave the station, if that thing doesn't go away." "Her name is Fluffy," Jake corrected, sipping his coffee while Fluffy lounged outside the conference room window, occasionally pressing her face against the glass to peer in at them. "And she's not hurting anyone. She made Lieutenant Morrison's lunch yesterday. Morrison left a perfectly good sandwich unattended. That's just poor planning." The truth was, Jake had never had a companion quite like Fluffy. She was surprisingly good company. She listened without judgment when he complained about station politics, she helped him reach high places during maintenance calls, and she had an uncanny ability to make even the most stubborn pests reconsider their life choices. Word was spreading beyond the station too. Jake had started receiving job offers from across the galaxy, all requesting the human and his pet death machine. "Pet is a strong word," Jake muttered, scratching behind what he hoped was Fluffy's equivalent of ears. She made that earthquake purr again and leaned into his touch, nearly knocking him over. The other species on the station had adapted with the kind of resilience that comes from really not having a choice. The crystalline hive mind had started leaving small gifts for Fluffy, which she collected carefully and arranged in what appeared to be a shrine to Jake in an unused storage bay. The gelatin merchants had begun selling "I Survived Uncle Death's Pet" t-shirts. The Zenthari flower people, practical as always, had simply started cooking larger meals since Fluffy had excellent table manners and always said please in her own way. "You know what the weird part is?" Jake told Fluffy one evening as they sat on the observation deck, watching the stars. "I think you're lonely too." Fluffy made a sound that was softer than her usual vocalizations, almost wistful. Jake had noticed that she never spoke about where she'd come from or why she'd chosen their station out of all the places in the galaxy. For a creature that could travel between star systems on her own, Harmony 7 seemed like an odd place to settle down. "The thing about being the toughest thing in the room," Jake continued, "is that everyone's either afraid of you or wants to use you. Not many beings just want to share lunch and complain about the weather." That's when Jake started noticing the changes. Other species were beginning to watch their interactions with something like wonder instead of terror. He caught Ambassador Claxon referring to him as Uncle Death in what sounded suspiciously like an affectionate tone. Children of various species would peek around corners to watch Fluffy help Jake with his work, giggling when she would carefully hold tiny tools in her massive claws. "You're changing things around here," Jake told her, making people think differently about what scary means. Fluffy rumbled something that sounded like agreement, then gently headbutted Jake's shoulder with enough force to remind him that she could have turned him into paste at any moment but chose not to. It was, Jake reflected, probably the most honest form of friendship he'd ever experienced. The galaxy had started calling him Uncle Death, the human who befriended monsters. But sitting there with Fluffy, watching her carefully rearrange her collection of gifts while humming something that might have been a lullaby, Jake realized the truth was simpler. Sometimes, the scariest things in the universe just needed someone to see past the claws and fangs to whatever was hurting underneath. "Tomorrow, we've got that fruit fly situation in hydroponics," Jake said. "Think you can handle backing me up without accidentally stepping on the entire garden?" Bully's response sounded suspiciously like laughter. The alarm that woke Jake at 300 hours wasn't the usual minor pest situation or diplomatic incident involving food allergies. This was the deep, bone-rattling klaxon that meant the station was under genuine attack. Jake rolled out of bed, grabbed a toolkit out of habit, and nearly tripped over Fluffy, who was already at his door and agitated in a way he'd never seen before. "What's got you spooked, girl?" Jake asked, but Fluffy was already moving, her massive form flowing through the corridors with lethal grace. Jake had to jog to keep up, passing panicked aliens and emergency response teams heading in the opposite direction. They reached the outer hull breach in Section 12, just as Commander Rodriguez and her security team were setting up a defensive perimeter. Through the emergency force field, Jake could see them. Void Reapers, dozens of them. The kind of parasitic hive mind creatures that could strip a space station down to its component atoms in under an hour. "Murphy," Rodriguez shouted over the chaos, "what are you doing here? And why did you bring that thing?" "Her name is Fluffy," Jake said automatically, then got his first good look at the situation. The Reapers were already eating through the hull faster than the repair systems could compensate. Their acid was specifically designed to dissolve the kind of alloys used in station construction. "And I think she's here because she knows what those things can do." Fluffy moved to the front of the defensive line, and for the first time since Jake had known her, she looked genuinely dangerous. Not playful dangerous or accidentally dangerous, but the kind of dangerous that had made her species legendary across the galaxy. She was no longer Jake's gentle companion. She was a Vorthok in full predator mode. The battle was brief and absolutely terrifying. Fluffy moved like liquid death, her claws slicing through Reapers with surgical precision while her 6 arms worked in perfect coordination. Jake watched his friend transform into something out of a nightmare, the creature that entire civilizations had learned to fear. She was beautiful and horrible and completely in her element. But there were too many Reapers, and they kept coming. For every 10 Fluffy destroyed, 20 more poured through the breach. Jake saw her stumble as acid ate through her left rear arm, saw her roar in pain and fury as more Reapers swarmed over her massive frame. "We need to evacuate," Rodriguez was saying into her comm. "Full station evacuation, all non-essential personnel to the escape pods." That's when Jake did something that would later be called either the bravest or stupidest thing in recorded galactic history. He walked past the security cordon, past the energy barriers, and directly into the swarm of Reapers. "Jake, no!" Rodriguez screamed, but Jake was already pulling something from his toolkit. Not a weapon, not some advanced piece of technology. A simple spray bottle, filled with what looked like soapy water. The Reapers that touched Jake's homemade solution began dissolving immediately, not dissolving other things, but actually dissolving themselves. Jake walked through the swarm like he was watering plants, spraying his mixture with the casual efficiency of someone who had spent decades dealing with pests. "Household ammonia and dish soap," Jake called out conversationally as Reapers fled from him in all directions. Turns out beings that evolved to dissolve metal have a real problem with basic cleaning products. Who would have thought? Within 10 minutes the breach was clear. The remaining Reapers had either been dissolved or fled back into space. Jake was standing in the middle of what had been a life-or-death battle, looking slightly bored and checking his spray bottle's fluid level. But Fluffy was hurt. Bad. The acid had eaten through her natural armor in several places, and one of her arms hung useless at her side. Jake was at her side immediately, his hands moving over her wounds with gentle competence. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "You did good. You did real good." That's when Fluffy did something that made every witness go completely silent. She reached into a pouch Jake hadn't even noticed before, and withdrew 3 objects. They were roughly the size of footballs, covered in the same midnight scales as Fluffy herself, and very obviously, eggs. No, not eggs. Cubs. Jake could see movement within the semi-amber shells, could make out tiny claws and the suggestion of golden eyes. Fluffy's cubs, probably close to hatching. Fluffy looked at Jake with those 4 golden eyes, and Jake suddenly understood. She hadn't come to Harmony 7 randomly. She'd come here because she was pregnant and needed somewhere safe to have her young. She'd stayed because she'd found not just safety, but someone she could trust. "Fluffy, I can't," Jake started to say, but she was already pressing the cubs into his arms with infinite care. Her purr had become labored, pained, but insistent. "I don't know how to raise Vorthak cubs. I don't even know what you eat besides turkey sandwiches." Fluffy made a sound that was unmistakably reassuring, then another that Jake interpreted as instructions. She was telling him it would be okay, that she trusted him, that he would figure it out, the same way he figured everything else out. "Mr. Murphy," Ambassador Claxon whispered from somewhere behind him. "Do you understand what this means?" Jake looked down at the 3 cubs in his arms. They were warm and surprisingly light, and he could feel them moving restlessly in their shells. Fluffy had just entrusted him with the most precious things in her existence. In Vorthak culture, Jake realized, this was probably equivalent to being named Godfather, Guardian, and Pack Leader all at once. Jake said quietly. "I think I'm about to become the galaxy's most unlikely babysitter." Fluffy's purr grew softer, more contented. She settled down beside Jake, wrapping her remaining good arms around both him and her cubs, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked completely at peace. Around them, the station's inhabitants watched in amazement as Uncle Death accepted the ultimate responsibility, keeping safe the next generation of the galaxy's apex predators. Jake Murphy, pest control specialist, had just become something unprecedented in galactic history. He'd become family to legends. The first thing Jake learned about raising Vorthak cubs was that nobody, and he meant absolutely nobody, had written a parenting manual for it. The second thing he learned was that baby apex predators were apparently just as prone to midnight crying fits as human babies. Except when a Vorthak cub cried, it sounded like a freight train having an existential crisis. Okay, Jake muttered at 3 a.m, bouncing little Destroyer in his arms while her siblings, Mayhem and Chaos, slept peacefully in their makeshift nest. What do you want? Food? Diaper change? A small planet to conquer? Destroyer's response was a sound that made the walls vibrate. Fluffy, still recovering in the medical bay, had managed to purr some basic care instructions before the sedatives kicked in, but her version of just feed them when they're hungry was complicated by the fact that Vorthak cubs apparently considered everything edible until proven otherwise. Jake had learned this the hard way when Mayhem had attempted to eat his toolkit, his coffee mug, and a substantial portion of his quarters furniture. The cubs were only a week old and already showing their species' legendary adaptability by treating Jake's living space like their personal chew toy. "Mr. Murphy," came Ambassador Claxon's voice through his doorcom, sounding distinctly nervous. Are you singing lullabies to them?" Jake paused in his rendition of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, which seemed to be the only thing that calmed Destroyer down. "It's called child care, Claxon. Haven't you ever heard of it? Not involving creatures that could theoretically devour a small moon, no?" The truth was, Jake was making it up as he went along, which was pretty much his approach to everything else in life. The cubs needed protein, so he'd arranged for the station's kitchens to provide them with something called processed meat product that looked suspiciously like the mystery meat from Earth School cafeterias. They needed exercise, so Jake had converted Storage Base 7 into a playground filled with things they could safely destroy. What he hadn't expected was how quickly they would imprint on him. Within days, the cubs were following Jake everywhere, their tiny claws clicking on the deck plates as they tried to keep up with his longer strides. Mayhem had developed an obsession with Jake's toolkit and would carefully carry individual tools in her mouth like some kind of helpful, terrifying assistant. Chaos had appointed himself Jake's official food taster, which meant Jake couldn't eat anything without a small predator climbing onto his lap to sample it first. Destroyer, the largest of the three, had taken to sleeping curled up on Jake's feet, which made walking interesting, but kept his ankles remarkably warm. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Yilmaz, the station's xenobiologist, told Jake during one of their weekly checkups. "Vorthak cubs in the wild don't typically bond with other species. They're usually raised communally by the entire pack." "Well," Jake said, watching Destroyer attempt to help him calibrate a sonic pest deterrent by batting at it with her tiny claws, "I guess I'm the pack now." The other station inhabitants had adapted to the sight of Jake Murphy conducting his daily rounds accompanied by 3 small but rapidly growing apex predators with varying degrees of acceptance. The crystalline hive mind had started leaving tiny gifts for the cubs, who collected them with the same dedication their mother had shown. The gelatin merchants had expanded their t-shirt line to include "I survived Uncle Death's daycare." The Zenthari flower people had begun growing special plants that the cubs could safely chew on, after Mayhem had eaten an entire display of decorative ferns. "Jake," Commander Rodriguez said during one of their daily briefings, "I've been getting reports that you're teaching them pest control techniques." "They're curious," Jake replied, shifting Chaos to his other shoulder, where the cub was intently watching him fill out paperwork. "And they're natural hunters. Seemed like a waste not to channel that productively." This was something of an understatement. The cubs had taken to Jake's work with the enthusiasm of children playing the galaxy's most dangerous game of pretend. They would crouch behind corners while Jake approached a pest situation, then pounce on any creatures that tried to flee. Their success rate was impressive, though their methods were occasionally more direct than Jake preferred. "No one ate an entire colony of garbage sprites yesterday," Rodriguez continued. "The sprites were destroying the waste recycling systems. The cubs were just being helpful. They're 3 weeks old, Jake. Smart kids." The real challenge wasn't the cubs' hunting instincts or their tendency to treat the station as their personal jungle gym. It was the fact that they were growing at an alarming rate. Destroyer was already the size of a large dog, and all 3 cubs were developing the same unsettling intelligence that made their mother so formidable. Jake would catch them having what looked like strategy discussions before tackles, or working together to solve problems that should have been beyond their developmental stage. "Mr. Murphy," Ambassador Claxon said one afternoon, finding Jake in Storage Base 7 teaching the cubs how to properly use a sonic disruptor. "Might I ask what you plan to do when they're, well, fully grown?" Jake looked at the 3 cubs, who were now roughly the size of ponies and showing no signs of slowing down. Mayhem had successfully stunned a target drone and was doing what appeared to be a victory dance. Chaos was methodically testing different frequency settings with scientific precision. Destroyer was watching Jake's technique with the focused attention of a dedicated student. "Same thing I do now, I guess," Jake said. "Figure it out as I go." That evening, As Jake sat in the observation deck with 3 increasingly large Vorthak cubs draped across and around him like the galaxy's most dangerous lapcats, he realized something had changed, not just in him, but in the entire station. People weren't afraid anymore. They were curious. Children of various species would ask their parents if they could pet Uncle Death's babies. Elderly beings would stop in the corridors to watch the cubs play, smiling in ways that translated across species barriers. "You know what's funny?" Jake told the cubs, who were all purring in their sleep. "Your mom probably saved more than just the station when she fought those Reapers. She gave everyone something to believe in, proof that scary doesn't have to mean evil." Destroyer opened one golden eye and made a small sound that might have been agreement, then went back to sleep. Outside the viewport, the stars continued their ancient dance, and Jake Murphy, pest control specialist turned interstellar father figure, wondered what tomorrow would bring. Probably something that would require a bigger toolkit. 6 weeks after the Reaper attack, Jake was in the middle of explaining to Destroyer why she couldn't eat the diplomatic courier from Andromeda Prime when the familiar earthquake purr echoed through the corridors of Harmony 7. The cubs' heads snapped up in perfect unison, their golden eyes bright with recognition and excitement. "Well," Jake said, setting down his spray bottle and straightening his work coveralls, "looks like Mom's feeling better." Fluffy appeared in the corridor entrance, and Jake was struck by how different she looked. Her wounds had healed completely, leaving barely visible scars across her midnight scales. She seemed larger somehow, more regal, carrying herself with the confidence of a creature who had faced the worst the universe could throw at her and emerged victorious. But her 4 golden eyes were fixed on Jake with an expression of unmistakable anxiety. The cubs rushed to their mother with sounds of pure joy, climbing over her massive frame and chattering excitedly in the complex harmonics that Jake had learned was Vortak family language. But Fluffy's attention remained focused on Jake, her head tilted in what he'd learned to recognize as a question. "They're fine," Jake assured her, understanding her concern. "All 3 of them. Mayhem learned how to operate the sonic disruptor, Chaos has been helping me with the monthly pest inventory, and Destroyer figured out how to open every sealed container on the station. They're smart, healthy, and they miss you." Fluffy's purr intensified, but Jake caught something else in her expression. Gratitude, yes, but also something that looked almost like sorrow. She nuzzled each of her cubs gently, then approached Jake with careful, deliberate steps. What happened next surprised everyone watching from the corridor entrances, where half the station's population had quietly gathered. Fluffy lowered her massive head until she was eye level with Jake, then very gently pressed her forehead against his. It was a gesture Jake had never seen her make before, but its meaning was unmistakable across species barriers. It was a goodbye. "You're leaving," Jake said softly. It wasn't a question. Fluffy's response was complex, a series of sounds that Jake interpreted as explanation and apology. She had duties, responsibilities to her own species. The cubs were old enough now to travel, to learn about their heritage beyond the comfortable confines of Harmony 7. They needed to understand what it meant to be Vorthak. "I get it," Jake said, though his voice was rougher than usual. "They need to know where they come from." But Fluffy wasn't finished. She made another sound, this one directed at her cubs, and Jake watched in amazement as Mayhem, Chaos, and Destroyer arranged themselves in a formal line in front of him. Their mother spoke to them in the harmonious language of their people, and Jake didn't need a translation to understand what was happening. This was ceremony. This was tradition. One by one, the cubs approached Jake. Mayhem pressed something into his hand, a small piece of her own scale, warm and smooth as polished obsidian. Chaos offered him one of his baby claws, sharp as a surgical blade but given with infinite trust. Destroyer, the largest and most solemn, touched Jake's forehead with hers, in the same gesture her mother had made. "They're claiming you," Ambassador Klaxon whispered from somewhere in the crowd. "As family, as pack. This has never been documented in galactic history." Fluffy spoke again, longer this time, and Jake felt tears prick at his eyes as he understood. The cubs would go with their mother to learn their heritage, but they would return. Harmony 7 was their home now. Jake was their pack leader, their chosen family. In the complex social structure of the Vorthok, he had been formally adopted as something beyond friendship, beyond alliance. He was their uncle, in every sense that mattered. "Take care of them," Jake told Fluffy, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "And teach them that being dangerous doesn't mean being cruel. They already know how to be gentle. Don't let them forget that." Fluffy's response was warm with affection and respect. She would remember. She would teach them to be proud of both their strength and their compassion, and she would tell other Vorthak about the human who had shown kindness to legends. The departure was surprisingly quick. One moment they were there, Jake's unlikely family filling the corridor with their presence, and the next they were gone, heading for the docking bay in the deep space that called to their kind. Jake stood alone in the suddenly quiet corridor, holding 3 precious gifts and feeling the weight of an honor he wasn't sure he deserved. "Mr. Murphy," Commander Rodriguez said quietly, "you know what this means, don't you?" Jake looked at the scale, the claw, and the memory of a gentle touch from creatures that could level cities. Around him, beings from dozens of species watched with something approaching awe. He'd become something unprecedented in galactic history. Not just the human who befriended monsters, but the one who'd been chosen by them as family. "Yeah," Jake said, pocketing his gifts and picking up his toolkit. "It means I need to get back to work. Those fruit flies and hydroponics won't deal with themselves." But as he walked away, Jake could hear the whispers following him through the corridors. Uncle Death, they called him. But the words carried new meaning now. Not just the human who wasn't afraid of dangerous things, but the one dangerous things came to when they needed safety, protection, understanding. 6 months later, Jake's reputation had spread beyond Harmony 7 to become something approaching legend throughout the galaxy. He received job offers from civilizations he'd never heard of, requests to mediate disputes between species that had been enemies for millennia, and more than one invitation to address the Galactic Council on Interspecies Relations. Jake turned them all down. He had work to do, creatures to relocate, pests to manage, and 3 young Vorthak to prepare for when they came home. Because they would come home. Family always did. Besides, he'd finally gotten his coffee mug replaced, and the new one read, "Galaxy's Most Unlikely Uncle." Jake figured that was about as accurate as job titles got. In the end, Jake Murphy remained exactly what he'd always been. A practical man who treated every problem like it could be solved with the right tools, the right attitude, and maybe a decent sandwich. The universe had just gotten a little bigger, a little stranger, and a lot more interesting. And somewhere in the deep space between stars, 3 young legends were learning that the scariest thing in the galaxy wasn't fangs or claws or the ability to destroy planets. It was the courage to be kind when kindness wasn't expected, to show mercy when mercy wasn't deserved, and to treat family like family, no matter how different they might look. They'd learned it from their Uncle Death, the human who'd figured it out.